Good morning, everyone. Now, welcome to South Africa's Energy Fiscal Policies webinar hosted by IISD, the Global Subsidies Initiative of IISD and TIPS. Today, we are going to hear about a new report released by IISD. We're also going to have some discussion on fiscal policy, on subsidy and tax policy, and how this impacts the energy transition. So I'm the moderator today. My name is Richard Bridle, and I'm a senior policy advisor at IISD. So the first thing for me to do is to introduce the speakers and panelists. So we're shortly going to move to opening remarks. That will be from Memory Mashingambi, a senior economist at the National Treasury of South Africa. I'm sure some of you know Memory and have heard her speak before. We're then going to have my colleague and our very own Chido Mazondo, the policy advisor at IISD, and one of the authors of IISD's report on this subject. She's going to be talking us through the main findings, the main conclusions, and setting up some kind of questions about what this might mean for recommendations for policy in future. We'll get then very lucky to be joined by some excellent panelists. We have Gayla Montmas-Claire, senior economist at TIPS, and Jessie Burton, senior associate from E3D, amongst other things, to respond to some of the issues raised by the report, and also to bring in any other subjects that are related to the energy transition and the impact of fiscal policy upon that transition. So just to do some housekeeping before we get started, we're currently recording this presentation and this webinar, and all being well, we will put that out on YouTube afterwards, and potentially also as a podcast. So hopefully no one objects to that. It will be shared, and we'll be sharing links afterwards. The report itself is available on the IISD webpage. I'll be putting a link in the chat shortly. And there will also be a press release and a video, which I'll share links to. And if you keep an eye on IISD's Twitter feed, which is at IISD News, or the Twitter feeds of Chido or myself, you can links to all of those kind of presentations explaining some of the highlights. So in terms of the format of the session today, after the opening remarks and the presentation, we're going to move to an interactive Q&A and panel discussion. This is going to be kicked off by Gayla and Jessie. We've also got a Q&A function in the webinar. So if you add questions throughout the webinar, I'll gather them together and put them to the panelists. And we'll also have the opportunity to take questions from the audience as well. So if you would like to speak or offer a comment, you can either enter a question in the Q&A and state that you'd just make a note that you'd like to pose that question yourself, or make a comment as well. So if you flag in the Q&A or in the chat that you'd like to respond and make a comment, you can send it to me or the panelists. Then I'll include as many of those as I have time for in the discussion at the end. The webinar is scheduled to run for an hour and a half, so hopefully we've got plenty of time for a good discussion at the end, and that will include comments from the floor. So it's not just going to be it'll be interactive too. So that's, I think, all the housekeeping announcements we have. I look forward to a good webinar, and I really hope, I'm very pleased to see as many participants as we've got. We've got more than 130. So without further ado, I'd like to turn the floor over to Memory, if Memory can unmute herself and put her video on. And we're very lucky to have Memory with us, and I'll turn the floor over to her for some opening remarks about this topic. So the floor is yours, Memory.
Thanks, Richard. Good morning, everyone. I try to be very quick in terms of, I'll just do, I guess, a brief presentation in terms of the opening remarks. Do you want me to run it from here or?
Yeah, I think if you can run it from there, we have a copy of it, so I could, but it might be easier for you to do it yourself if you have it available.
Okay. All right. While I'm getting the. Okay. All right. So in terms of what I'm going to talk about, let me know when you can see my screen. Hello?
Yes, Memory, we can see your screen. Thank you.
Thank you. All right. So I guess to kick off this, I'm just going to talk about the main reason why we have, in terms of our commitments as a country to COP26 and looking at how the world is moving forward in terms of low carbon transition. So I guess the South African government is committed to reducing greenhouse gas emissions. We're committed to carbon pricing, and we're committed to reducing and phasing out fossil fuel subsidies. And in a way that is responsible, because we're also looking at what the impact is like on the low income households as we transition. We sit in a very peculiar place where we are a top 20 global emitter of greenhouse gas emissions. Our per capita emissions are even higher than a lot of developed countries. So with our updated NDC that we submitted at COP26, we're showing as a government that we are committed to reducing emissions. And within the national determined contributions that we submitted, we have a suite of policies, of which the carbon tax is one of the most important. And in terms of the policy direction, we've had an environmental fiscal reform policy that we introduced in 2006. And within that policy, we have a framework of how to price tax, negative externalities and tax incentives for positive externalities. So although by introducing a carbon tax, which took us 10 years, we are putting that signal out to the South African economy that you need to transition. And it took us 10 years to get the carbon tax in place. But by introducing the carbon price that we are phasing in at low rates, we're hoping gradually that we are influencing the future investment decisions, consumer decisions, and production reasons that people will take into account as we move forward. And yes, we have a lot of tax exemptions within the carbon tax design, but this was also in recognition of the state of our economy, the fact that we are a developing country, and we still have part of our population that still needs to access energy. So it is in that context that we looked at phasing in the carbon tax, not at the externality price that the social cost of carbon will tell you, but we also implemented a carbon price for us to gain the first mover advantage amongst developing countries, so that would stimulate development, because that carbon price within the economy sends that signal for companies and households to start changing their decisions in terms of what they invest in and what they purchase. We also have a number of targeted revenue recycling measures to sort of work through and reduce the impacts of energy pricing, because I think those who do the modeling a lot of the times reports say it is a regressive tax, but by putting in place targeted revenue recycling measures, we can reduce that regressivity. And also by reducing our greenhouse gas emissions, we will improve our air quality, because in areas like Mpumalanga, our air quality is really bad. So just in terms of the design of the tax, there's a lot of tax-free allowances. We've got a 60% basic tax-free allowance. We've got an allowance for trade exposure to cushion industry from competitiveness effects. We've got a 10% for process and fugitive emissions, because those processes cannot do much in terms of reducing their emissions because of the fixed production methodologies. We also have an emissions intensity allowance, which is a performance allowance of 5%, and a 5% extra allowance for carbon budgets that are being implemented by the Department of Environment, and a 5 or 10% allowance for carbon offsets. We allow industry to use flexibility, invest in your activities that are not covered by the carbon tax to reduce your tax liability. We also have an no impact electricity price neutrality for the first phase, because the first phase is from 1 June 2019 to 31 December 2022. And some of the revenue recycling measures we've implemented include an energy efficiency tax incentive and the electricity price neutrality that I talked about, which actually credits electricity producers for their IPP electricity purchases and the electricity generation levy, and also trying to cushion the low-income households in terms of impacts on transportation and the solar water geysers program. So in light of the tax-free allowances I talked about, I think one of the main recommendations from the paper is we need to phase them out, and we agree. But so in terms of the phase 2, which starts from 1 January 2023 to 31 December 2030, we are going to make announcements in the budgets. That's like in 3 weeks. But we also understand we have updated our NDC and we need to be more ambitious. So if you look at our current tax rate, it's really low. It ranges from 0.5 from 50 cents to $3.60 US. And because within the Carbon Tax Act, we have indicated the price rate trajectory, which is the inflationary from 2023. But in terms of also the reports that have come out, the high level on carbon pricing, they say we should be pricing our carbon from between $50 and $100 US by 2030. And the IMF has also done a study where they recommend an international carbon pricing floor of about $25 US per ton from up until 2030, especially for developing countries like South Africa. So those are the kind of considerations that we're going to take into account in the proposals that you will hear in the budget in terms of where are we going to go with our carbon pricing rate from 2023. And just to emphasize that when we did modeling in 2016 before the implementation of the tax, and it showed that we could actually reduce our emissions below business as usual by almost 33% by 2035. And this model was a CGE modeling. And it assumed that from 2021, we start phasing out the tax-free allowances by 10% annually. So in terms of, I think one of the other recommendations was also in terms of fuel pricing in South Africa. We implement fuel taxes, and as you can see, our fuel prices are actually lower than some of the developing countries. And if you look at the amount of, we impose fuel taxes as a revenue generation mechanism also. But if you look at this graph, you can see that most of the fuel tax increases were mostly for the RAF, for us to fund the road accident fund. But in terms of pricing externalities, we have some of that portion covered, but also it's been used also as it's also a revenue raising mechanism. But if you look at the amount of fuel taxes as a percentage of price, you'll see that for 2021, it was around 35%. And it was 41% in 2020, mainly because the fuel prices went really low because of the COVID pandemic. But if you look at our average, which is around early 30s, we are still lower than some countries. You know, their taxes are like 65%. And it's something we are also looking at. And I guess in terms of the carbon fuel levy, we only started implementing it in 2019 when the carbon tax came into effect, and it's not a lot. So the proposals that are going to come in this budget will also talk to that on how we're thinking of going through with that. And then the government also is implementing a just energy transition. COP26, the 2nd of November, we got $8.5 billion I guess, a grant for us to help us transition. But we just wanted to emphasize that in 2019, we already, as a treasury, this was published in the budget review, we already signaled that we wanted to position the electricity sector to embrace clean technology and move towards diversifying generation, and also getting a lot of producers in the mix. And this is, I think, in terms of unbundling of ESCOM, which is underway right now, this was already signaled in the budget to show that as a government, we're forward thinking in 2019 that that's something that was being considered. So in as much as there is, I guess, within the report, that recognition that there needs to be a transition in the electricity sector, it's something that the government has been thinking about, and it's something that we already signaled, and it's happening now. And then just to conclude and say, you know, we understand that climate change is the biggest risk that's facing humanity. And we're looking at taking steps. We're working, you know, we've published a sustainable finance paper, a draft green taxonomy as a treasury, because we recognize that we need to look at those risks and how they will affect our economy, and take a proactive approaches to reduce the impacts as much as we can. And with the carbon price, we're providing the adequate incentives. It might be a lower price at the moment, but it was also a way of us phasing it in. And in terms of providing a price signal, so that in terms of our research and how we do production, things will start changing. And as a treasury, we feel that the carbon tax is a key tool, because we need to have that pricing signal in the economy. And, you know, also to just emphasize that currently it is low because of the tax-free allowances, but going forward, that's something we are considering in how we move forward and reduce some of those tax-free allowances, so that we also implement a higher effective carbon price, but at the same time look at not consider the impact on the low-income households and how that will affect them, and how we ensure that there is access to clean energy across society. And there are other initiatives from other government departments that we're also working on as a treasury to ensure their implementation, for example, the green transport strategy and how that can be implemented. So with that, I say thank you. And I guess we'll take questions later.
Thank you very much, Memory. That was really interesting and very comprehensive, and it's really important to understand the context in which we're operating and to have the Treasury's perspective on some of the trends. I think there'll be a lot of people looking out for the budget 2022 announcement with some of the and to understand a bit more about how you see the carbon tax developing. So as we move on, I'd like to pass it over to Chido Mozondo, IISD's very own policy advisor, who will be presenting IISD's report, looking at fiscal policy, picking up a lot of the themes that Memory has raised already. So just a final thank you to Memory, and pleased to remind you that please place questions into the Q&A function. I've seen we've had some really great questions in there and in the chat already. I'm collecting them and collating them, and this will all be available online. As I mentioned earlier, there'll be a video, and we'll see if we can share the presentations as well. So yes, over now to Chido. Chido, welcome, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Richard. Can you see my screen?
Yes, I can see your screen.
Perfect. Thank you so much. And thank you, Dr. Masingabi. I think your opening remarks it's encouraging to hear that National Treasury is actively thinking about environmental fiscal reform and the biggest problem facing our planet, which is climate change. So as Richard said, I'm just going to be providing a very brief overview of the report that has just gone live on our website. It's been 18 months of hard work, and I encourage you to engage with the report more closely. There is a link in the chat. So firstly, what were some of the aims of this piece of work? So this report explores the extent to which South Africa's current energy fiscal policies are aligned with goals relating to the development of a robust domestic energy system that can provide low carbon energy to all at a fair cost. The report is intended to support government and foster informed discussion among national stakeholders. And there may be questions about why do we do this piece of work? Why is it relevant? So firstly, understanding energy fiscal policies, of which subsidies and taxes are a subset, are important for several reasons. Firstly, subsidies are one of the key economic policy levers that government can use to influence energy production and consumption. If energy fiscal policies are in place that act against stated policy objectives for political or legacy reasons, transparency and debate can hold governments to account to align energy fiscal policies with stated government policy. Secondly, subsidies and taxes, come at a high cost to the public budget and are often linked to health and environmental public objectives. So it is essential that the impacts of subsidy policies are monitored and debated. And then thirdly, fossil fuel subsidies increase the consumption of fossil fuels, worsening local air pollution and greenhouse gas emissions. So just briefly, before we go into the key findings, to look at the scope and definitions that we used just to qualify. So this assessment encompassed all types of commercial modern energy, electricity, fossil fuels, including coal, natural gas, and petroleum, so crude oil and its products, nuclear energy, and large-scale hydroelectricity and renewable energy. Biomass and small-scale renewables and biofuels were not included. There is also a section on renewable energy policies, which covers large-scale grid solar PV and wind. The revenue section includes electricity and fossil fuels, and then there's also an analysis of the social cost of energy, but this is limited to the combustion of fossil fuels. This assessment included a full life cycle of energy extraction, production, and retirement of all energy types. An assessment of the full life cycle of energy extraction, production, and retirement was beyond the scope of this report, And then in addition, we also singled out several other categories that are not energy specific, but predominantly benefit one type of energy. So this includes electricity transmission and distribution, which mostly benefit coal because of its dominance in South Africa's electricity mix. And then we also looked at bailout packages for airlines and Eskom, which mainly provide benefits to the oil and gas sector and coal, of course. And then all other categories in the report include the full value chain of production and consumption. For example, oil and gas includes upstream subsidies for refineries and downstream subsidies for retail consumers. The subsidy database attempts to capture all subsidies and taxes provided by the national government to these sectors, and it covers three financial years from 2018 to 2020. So in terms of definitions, of course, because we're talking about subsidies and taxes, it's important to have an understanding of how we define that in the report. So our definition of subsidies is based on Article 1 of the Agreement on Subsidies and Countervailing Measures of the World Trade Organization of 1994. And this agreement defines the following 4 types of subsidies. So firstly, direct and indirect transfer of funds and liabilities, budget outlays, government revenue foregone, which is often reduced tax rates and tax exemptions, provision of goods or services below market value, such as water or land, and then income price support through market regulations, including non-enforcement. So in the publication, the term subsidy and government support are used synonymously. And then in terms of defining taxes and non-tax revenues, taxes, this definition follows the National Treasury and OECD definition, which are unrequited payments to the general government budget enforced through legislation. So unrequited in this instance means that benefits provided by the government to taxpayers are not normally in proportion to their tax payments. And then duties and statutory levies are compulsory payments and therefore also considered a tax. Non-tax revenues are all other government revenues that are not classified as taxes, such as royalties and rents from fossil fuel extraction. Administrative fees and user charges are requited and therefore not taxes, and are included in this report where relevant to energy revenues. The database encompasses revenues from the consumption and production of fossil fuels, as well as income and profits derived from fossil fuel industries. So these definitions, particularly the definition of what is considered a subsidy, are often debated because some publications may use different definitions. For example, with the carbon tax, some may argue that the existing carbon tax exemptions in South Africa are not a subsidy. However, according to the definition we use from the World Trade Organization, government revenue foregone, in other words, reduced tax rates and tax exemptions, do qualify as subsidies. So it's important to make that qualification. So now let's get into sort of the meat of the report, which are some of the key findings from the report. So this is an overview which highlights, so as I said, we looked at 3 financial years, and this is a highlight of all the energy subsidies by energy type from 2017 to 2020. So the energy subsidies quantified in the study totaled to 172 billion rand in the most recent year, 2020 to 2021. That equates to about $10.4 billion. So this includes subsidies to fossil fuels, electricity, hydroelectricity, nuclear, as well as carbon tax exemptions and bailouts for several carbon-intensive industries. The largest subsidies were for fossil fuel and coal-fired electricity, and there were a significant number of subsidies for, renewables were identified, but we could not quantify them because of a lack of data. So also it's important to note that the total subsidy estimate should be viewed as conservative given the number of unquantified subsidies. If we look to the first graph over here, 2017 to 2018, and then we compare that to here, we can see that energy subsidies more than tripled from 58 billion rand, which is about $4 billion, to 172 billion, as I've said, in 2020, 2021. So the main reasons for these increases were the bailout of Eskom, which equated to 56 billion rand in 2020, 2021. And this was the largest quantified subsidy for that year and equivalent to about 10% of Eskom's total accumulated debt of about 488 billion. So this effectively, supported the ongoing combustion of coal in South Africa, which made up 88% of the electricity mix in 2018, with Eskom producing more than 90% of total power supply. The second largest contribution to this was tax-free emission allowances for energy productions under the carbon tax regime. And this was estimated to be 47 billion rand of foregone revenue in 2020-2021. So the carbon tax was introduced in June 2019. Therefore, exemptions were included for part of 2019-2020 and then for the full 2020-2021 financial year. And then we also saw that electricity subsidies increased if you compare from 2017 to 2021, 8% to 16 billion rand. And oil and gas subsidies increased by 18% to 35 billion rand. We also saw a rise in support for nuclear energy, which increased from 519 million rand in 2017-2018 to 920 million rand in 2020-2021. And this support largely consisted of direct transfers to the South African Nuclear Energy Corporation. In terms of renewables, there was insufficient data publicly available to quantify the value of renewable energy subsidies for the most recent financial year. So as we've just saw, the major subsidies now, in terms of classifying them by subsidy mechanisms, we saw that the majority of subsidies were delivered as transfer of funds and liabilities, notably bailouts, or as foregone revenue, such as the carbon tax and VAT exemptions. The remainder comprised income or price support, and then the provision of goods and services below market value. In terms of renewable energy policies, we identified 6 support policies for renewable energy in South Africa. The only 2 that could be quantified were funding for institutions to support research and development. And also to estimate some of these would require some methodological estimation. But to do this, we would need to identify a suitable price for wholesale price of electricity. So now moving from, the bailouts to now the consumption revenue and then the production revenue. So consumer energy taxes are a key source of revenue in many countries because they are relatively simple to administer and difficult to evade. They also have low price elasticity in the short term and can be designed to be progressive. The vast majority of fossil fuel and carbon taxes quantified are derived from transport fuel consumption in South Africa. So the single largest source of tax revenue, as we found in the report, is the general fuel levy, which generated almost 83 billion rand in 2019-2020, which is about 5.9% of all government revenue and about 1.6% of the GDP. So revenue from the general fuel levy is reduced by around 10% once diesel fuel refunds are taken into account. And these rebates are foregone tax revenue and therefore represent subsidies, according to the definition that we used. It is also evident that at present, with all the exemptions, the carbon tax does not contribute much in terms of government revenue and decrease in the cost of consuming fossil fuels. This is just a closer look into the consumption revenue. And the road accident levy, RAF levy, at 2.18 rand per litre for both diesel and petrol and diesel, is paid into a fund that compensates victims of traffic accident. And the RAF levies generated about 289 million US dollars in 2019-2020, where you can see here the rand value, 4,786 million in rand. However, the funds received from the RAF fuel levy on an annual basis are not sufficient to pay annual liabilities, and debt has been accumulating for several decades due to this. So as a result, the RAF levy has been regularly increasing over the years. So in 2019-2020, the RAF had an unfunded claims liability of 331 billion rand, resulting in delays in the payments of claims. There are also fuel levies on aviation fuel to discourage high octane use in inland areas and to recoup transport expenses and the cost of injecting an illuminating dye into paraffin to trace illegal adulteration of diesel. So customs and excise are also applied to fossil fuels, both for petrol and diesel, but disaggregated revenue data was not available. The fuel price build-up also includes wholesale and retail margins, several minor levies, and distribution and transport costs. So now moving from consumption to production revenue, the 2 quantifiable sources of revenues from fossil fuel production were the corporate income tax and the mineral and petroleum resource royalties, which in the graph you'll see is abbreviated to MPRR. So MPRR is a resource rent or royalty rather than a tax, as it compensates the states the South African state, for the permanent loss of non-renewable resources. So in 2019-2020, coal generated 1,741 million rand, or 15% of MTPR revenues. And then the amount generated by oil and gas was not publicly available, but it is likely to be low, given South Africa's domestic crude oil resources are small, producing around 1,800 barrels per day. Then the second production revenue line item, the corporate income tax, amounted to 1,593 million in 2019-2020, as we can see over here. And then in addition, personal income tax from individual taxpayers with business income, from coal and petroleum sector was around 82 million rand for 333 taxpayers in 2019. So the full amount of income tax paid from those employed in the fossil fuel sector would be significantly higher, but disaggregated data is not available for individuals without business income. So I apologize, there was a lot of numbers, but it's important to understand, what does this actually mean for South Africa and for the energy sector? So this section estimates key externalities for the combustion of fossil fuels in South Africa, based on data obtained from a literature review using conservative values. So also just a caveat before we dive into these numbers, for the estimated cost per unit, we use publicly available figures. So there are others. So depending on your view on what the social cost of carbon is, or the figures that you use, these numbers could change significantly. So we want to situate this discussion within that context, but we have taken fairly conservative numbers. So it's important to note that quantifying externalities is challenging because it involves assigning financial value to non-financial impacts. So even where market prices are available, such as the carbon price, the correct price can be contentious. So due to the complexity of estimation, we have limited quantification to 3 costs, although there are many other negative externalities that contribute to the true negative external cost of fossil fuels. So we looked at 3, so mortality due to air pollution, morbidity or disease due to air pollution, and then climate change impacts of greenhouse gas emissions. So for morbidity, we only accounted for work lost days due to the challenges of costing the health and productivity costs associated with hospital admissions due to air pollution related cardiovascular diseases. Societal costs, societal costs associated with air pollution and greenhouse gas emissions by fossil fuel use in South Africa were estimated to be a minimum of 550 billion rand, which is about $33 billion per year. So this estimate, again, to reiterate, was conservative, since only fossil fuel consumption was included, and conservative or mid-range values from the literature were used. Well, I won't go through all of it, but then to look at now comparing the fossil fuel subsidies, tax and non-tax government revenues, and the social costs. So when we compare these, we found that externalities reveal the social costs are 5 times higher than the revenues that government generates from fossil fuel taxation. So while there is uncertainty about some of these estimates, the overall finding is that social costs far exceed revenues generated from fossil fuels. Both subsidies and tax revenues are far outweighed by the social costs, as I said, but the public are paying the price for the use of fossil fuels and paying a much greater bill than the government is. The cost of fossil fuels to the community are higher than the revenues that they can generate. So this brings about questions as, are these fiscal instruments suitably targeted in South Africa? So now to look at some of the key findings and recommendations from the report. So I'll just look at 2 for the interest of time, but the first really is that fossil fuel subsidies are too high in South Africa. So as I've already stated, in the most recent financial year, these subsidies amounted to 172 billion rand. And in thinking about some recommendations, there's a need to reform and reduce bailouts to Eskom. So bailouts distort the price of electricity generated from coal and fail to account for its true cost. And similarly make the price of electricity generated from coal seem cheaper than it actually is. Of course, we understand that reducing bailouts to Eskom has been necessary to date due to the financial position that the utility was in. But if future bailouts are to continue, a recommendation could be to tie these bailouts to reforming the utility to invest in more renewable energy. Then the second recommendation is about the carbon tax. So there's a need to end exemptions to the carbon tax. Such a tax should be applied across the economy at a level that is proportional to the external cost of the emissions. And again, we're not saying that we should have an abrupt end of these exemptions, but that gradually the carbon tax exemptions should be phased out. And then finally, we believe that there's a need for transparency in energy fiscal policies. And this is important to understand the signals that government is sending and to ensure effective reporting and to increase accountability. As you would have heard me say throughout the presentation, some values we couldn't get because they weren't publicly available. And in order for us to make sure we're moving in the right direction as South African citizens and residents, we need to be aware of where the money that our tax is going to. And then secondly, second finding is pollution associated with fossil fuel use places a heavy cost on the health of South Africa's citizens and residents. The social cost of fossil fuel use exceeds subsidies and revenues generated from them. As I've already said, in a single year, it was calculated that the social cost of fossil fuel use was 266, that should say billion, excuse me, and the environmental cost was 283 billion. And in terms of recommendations, we have a few that we thought would be relevant. So first, there's a need for a review of current energy fiscal policies, and it's encouraging to have heard Dr. Machingabi speak about the fact that this is currently underway in National Treasury. But we believe that government should review energy fiscal policies and align them with more ambitious and nationally determined contributions in line with the Paris Agreement. It is crucial that the price of fossil fuels reflect social and environmental costs. Secondly, we believe that the revenue generated by efficient pricing of fossil fuels could be used as targeted support for vulnerable households. So efficiently targeting taxes to fossil fuels can create an additional revenue source which can be used to support lower and middle income households. And then lastly, increasing fossil fuel taxes is an important stage in the energy transition. Revenue generated from fossil fuel subsidies and taxation can be invested into the energy system, or rather into the energy transition, in ways that stimulate jobs, economic growth, and fund a just transition for core workers and communities. And then finally, to end off, what is the way forward? So I've mentioned some of the recommendations which fit into this, but we believe that there's a need for this remove, target, and swap approach. So remove, firstly, as I've said again, is phasing out fossil fuels that have no or little potential for energy access. So again, we're not arguing for complete removal of, let's say, fossil fuel subsidies such as the free basic electricity allowance, because that has an energy access imperative to it. But potentially, this is where the last point comes in, the swap is where you swap that type of subsidy or that type of support for vulnerable households to support renewable energy. So instead of providing electricity from largely coal-fired power stations, potentially from some of our renewable energy sources. Then the second option, which is target, again, speaks to some of what I've just said, is making sure that we have targeted subsidies aimed at access for those that really need them. So we should not have, or we should limit the amount of inefficient subsidies that currently exist, and such as the free basic electricity allowance. There's a need to understand who exactly benefits from that type of allowance, and is there a way that we can better target that to make sure that truly those who are most vulnerable and indigent are able to receive the benefit of electricity access. And then the last one is really swapping. So there's a need to look at opportunities for shifting fossil fuel subsidies to investments in renewable energy and energy efficiency. So this can help improve and support households and also improve the sustainability of energy access. And that's basically, the report in short. But I thank you for your time. And again, I encourage you to engage the report more closely, as it is a lot more, there's a lot more detail to go through. But thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Chido. That was a fascinating presentation, and I'm sure there's a lot of numbers and lots to think over there. We've already had a very active session in the chat, and we've got lots of questions in the Q&A, so it's obviously creating a reaction, and people are engaging with it. Before we move to the Q&A session, I'm just mindful that we've got a few more minutes of memories time, and there were a number of questions that have already come through in the chat that I wanted to put to memory. So the first one relates to the Just Transition Partnership, which was the announced deal around the time of COP26 around a climate finance package of $8.5 billion that was to be used for various kind of investment projects, including hydrogen and renewables, and it wasn't quite clear about whether gas would be eligible or not. So I just wondered if you could tell us anything about the development of that deal, and how you see it fitting into the kind of broader fiscal policy framework.
Thanks, Richard. Sorry, Richard Worthington. I'm in the budget mode. I talked of a grant instead of a concessional loan. So in terms of, I think there's a lot of interest in terms of what's happening. I think that particular transaction, the Just Energy transaction, is mostly being handled by the presidency. But just to say, as a government, there is movement forward. I think in November, after the COP26, there's been already a creation of the interministerial committee that will oversee that transaction, and it has a number of institutions that are going to be part of it: the Treasury, DFFE, I think the IDC, Minerals and Energy, Public Enterprises. So announcements are going to come very soon in terms of how that's going to be rolled out. But rest assured, we are working on it as government, and I think announcements are going to be made very soon in terms of how that's going to be handled. And I think once that's done, it's going to map out how what's going to happen, because I think part of the sort of conditions was how we transition ESCOM and the old power stations, how they're going to be decommissioned and such like. So that's what I can say about that. Thanks, Richard.
So a second question just relates to the carbon tax, and you mentioned that there's an announcement in budget 2022 expected about the next phase of the carbon tax. There were a couple of questions about whether or not, as kind of revenues become more significant, perhaps when policy changes, whether there's any kind of ring fencing of those revenues planned, or how those revenues are likely to kind of start to be recycled. So I wonder if you have anything to say on that.
Okay, so I think as a treasury, we don't ring fence revenue, we don't earmark revenues, because that introduces fiscal rigidities within the system. Because if you earmark the revenue for particular programs, over time, if the tax is working, then the emissions are supposed to be going down, which means revenues are supposed to reduce. So if you earmark, how will you fund those particular projects? So we don't earmark revenues. But I think even in the current carbon tax, we've indicated, there are programs that we actually supporting or they're funded through the Fiscal. So for example, the energy efficiency tax incentive, we've had that since 2013 because we thought we were going to implement the carbon tax in 2015. And I think to date, the Fiscal, that particular tax incentive by itself has cost the Fiscal over 5 billion rands. So there are programs that we support, and given the low rates of the carbon tax, we are supporting that. Like there's more support from the Fiscal for a number of projects that if they'd been earmarked to the carbon tax, we wouldn't be able, to be able to support those programs. So we also have electricity price neutrality commitment out of the realization that we can't exclude ESCOM from the carbon tax because more than 40% of the emissions are from electricity generation. But also consumers don't have a choice of where they source their electricity. So that electricity price commitment, what it does is I guess they can reduce their tax liability by the cost of the IPPs, generated electricity, and also the electricity generation levy. And over time, all announcement for phase 2 in terms of the carbon tax rates, how allowances are going to be phased out and the likes, they're going to be announced in the budget. So I can't say much now until the minister has made the announcements. And so in light of that, those are, I guess, the things we're looking at. So we'd rather have targeted support for particular, public transport, for example, solar water heaters, or, a successor program. How do we encourage those instead of just having, we ring fence the revenue without having, programs that we are going to support? And also in terms of the just energy transition, what are we going to support in terms of the just energy transition from the fiscals? So we don't want to box ourselves in terms of ring fencing, but we have programs that we are going to announce in terms of these are the things we're looking at as a government to support as we transition to the low carbon economy. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Memory, and thank you for being so generous with your time and for answering questions as well. I'd like to move to the start of the Q&A discussion at this point. So firstly, we are very lucky to have Gayla from TIPS with us. And Gayla, would you like to respond to anything you've heard, and also to raise any other issues that you think we should be thinking about when we talk about fiscal policy and energy fiscal policy?
Yeah, thanks so much, Richard. And let me start by, I think, congratulating the team on really the report and the effort that you've put into really fleshing out some really critical issues around energy fiscal policies and what that means in a South African context. I think as a starting point, and just coming out of your findings, I would raise that the urgency to reform is evident. Change is required, and really just continuing on a business as usual approach is really not an option. The degree of inequalities in the country are persisting. When you just reflect on the fact that 43% of households in South Africa are into energy poverty, that's just quite striking, really, and a reminder that we need to certainly shift gear when it comes to energy access. The technological transition is unfolding forever rapidly. That's through economics and policy developments, and that's evident in the energy sector, both in terms of electricity but also liquid fuel. And again, I think being in line with that transition is important. Then I think we cannot ignore that we're part of a global ecosystem, and if we don't start shifting, the world will shift us, at our expense. And very clearly through border carbon adjustments, which are carbon taxes at the border of some countries. These are coming. The EU has made announcements from 2023. There will be taxes on our exports to the EU, notional from 2023 and effective from 2026. That's not a lot of time to adjust, and these will be conditioned on the carbon intensity of our economy and whether or not we have adequate policies in place. So I think the urgency to shift is really clear. But then we also need to reflect in terms of, shift from where we are, that's important, but shift to what? What should we do going forward? When we look at environmental taxes in South Africa, they have been woefully inefficient to date, with maybe only two that have worked somewhat, which is on plastic bags and on incandescent light bulbs. And they worked because alternatives were easy, industry was on board, and consumers could kind of shift pretty easily. All others have not worked, because they're either too low or there's just no alternative. If you tax something, but there's just no alternative, then of course it's not going to have an impact. And you can see that quite strikingly with the levy on non-renewable energy. You can see that with our carbon tax on motor vehicles. I mean, on an average South African car, a carbon tax on motor vehicles around 6,000 Rand. That's just not going to shift the consumer at all. I mean, let's just be upfront about it. We also have to acknowledge that globally, the evidence shows that carbon pricing to date hasn't really had an impact on emissions, because it's often too low, not implemented properly, and not part of a bigger package. So, having this approach that we can just, have carbon pricing and that's going to solve all our problems is extremely misguided, because actually evidence to date shows that it doesn't work. So what is our overall approach? What's our package? How are we going to do that? And how are we going to do that, in an inclusive manner? If you look at who spends money on what, if you look at households, when you find that, the poorest of the country spend on average more than 10% of their income on energy, while the richest in the country spend less than 2%. Of course, in absolute terms, the richer you get, the more you spend on energy. But in relative terms, in terms of your income, you spend a lot less. So you have an energy price and an energy system that's extremely regressive as it stands. How do you flip this? And by the way, it's the same for water, or transport. So overall, so it's not just energy. So how do you flip this? Through of course pricing, but also a transition of your system overall. How do you make sure that you use subsidies or support like the free basic electricity, or the free basic alternative energy subsidy to really support households? When you look at your free basic alternative energy subsidy, which is a subsidy for households that don't have grid connection, so they can't get the free basic electricity, it's quite striking to see that there are more households in the country that get support for paraffin and fire gel, which are dirty and harmful, than they are for solar-based systems, through the free basic alternative energy. So then it's about, you have an important subsidy, but then do you use it effectively? Does it reach the households that it needs to reach first? And then does it subsidize the right thing? Because if we can put money into dirty fuel, then we can certainly put money into solar energy. The same is true when it comes to transport and about electric vehicles. Do we subsidize effectively petrol cars, or are we going to put support towards electric vehicles and public transportation? And again, we find that there's currently no support towards electrification of transport, and that the support towards public transportation is very uneven when it comes to the level of ridership, and probably mistargeted in many respects. Similarly, when we look at our support in terms of the cross-subsidization of our electricity price, we need to kind of understand who should bear the burden of the electricity pricing going forward. And when you see special agreements for some industrial customers that have preferential pricing that effectively end up being subsidized by other customers, you need to ask yourself the question if this is warranted. And it might be in some cases if those industries are really strategic, but we should at least have the question and being open about it and saying, okay, should the rest of the customers in the country, industrial, commercial, and residential, subsidize particular industrial industries? And I think more broadly as well, then, and that's my last point, we need to think about the tools that we want to use and the signals that that we want to send. When you talk about the green taxonomies, I think we've all seen in Europe, the risk of including, gas and nuclear in such a taxonomy that would really open the floodgate, and I think we need to resist that. But then it's about using taxes versus mandates, and I've seen some interesting discussion in the chat about, how we use carbon taxes and should it be used in some cases or not. We have, if we want to, the tools to really focus and fast track our transition. We've seen that in some cases, policies can work. The REAP is an example. We focused and it worked very quickly when we wanted it to work. We could shift ESCOM very quickly. We could shift SOEs very quickly, as well as all municipal buildings, for instance. That doesn't need a carbon price. Carbon price is not going to have any impact on this, actually. What you need is a mandate. So you need to ask the question about whether or not the carbon price is the right tool in some cases. Of course, carbon tax and carbon pricing plays a role in the rest of the industry. But again, we need to ask ourselves, how do we make this not a regressive tool? And I think that's some of the key questions that effectively we need to be asking. So in summary, for me, it's the urgency to reform is really important, but we need to be mindful of doing that in an inclusive way, and in that using the right tools to make sure that we don't push, I think, the burden once more on consumers, particularly low-income consumers, when we should be putting it on producers and polluters rather than the rest of society. So I'll leave it at this for now, and I look forward to further discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gaylor. And without further ado, I'll turn to Jessie, who's been waiting very patiently there. Thank you, Jessie, for joining us today. And please, the floor is yours. What do you think?
Thanks, Richard. I'm sorry, we're going to be one of those terrible panels where we just agree with each other because Gaylor has literally taken the words out of my mouth on several issues. First of all, I want to say thank you to Cheeto and the team at IISD. I've worked on fossil fuel inventories in the past. They're an incredibly difficult topic to work on. There are methodological arguments, there's data issues, there's philosophical questions, and those data issues are very challenging, as you pointed out with the renewables. And this is a really, really great contribution. I think it's very powerful to show the challenges of transition, that fossil fuel subsidies have actually grown over time. And that also for me highlights the kind of deep embeddedness of pricing, regulation and subsidies in South Africa's political economy. So two things to flag, similar to what Gaylor has already mentioned. First of all, those ESCOM bailouts. South Africa we're in a bind. We've backed ourselves into a corner on this issue. So we've accumulated enormous, and I say we because we're all going to pay. It was ESCOM, but it was for everyone. We've accumulated enormous levels of debt associated to Medupi and Kusile and to not having cost-reflective tariffs. But I think we can even go one step further and say, who's actually benefiting from these bailouts? At some level, they benefit everyone, right? Because they stand in for price rises. But we know that it is heavy industry who are large beneficiaries. The energy intensive user group is still more than 30% of electricity demand in the country because of that electricity intensive nature of our economy. And although there's been a lot of demergers and shifts, a lot of big corporations are still the coal suppliers who've had extraordinary increases in coal over the last few years. So I want to say, the minerals energy complex, to use a 1990s frame of reference, persists. And we are being forced to prop it up because the alternatives are not in place. That transition that Gaylor has spoken about has been very delayed for political reasons that we all know very well. And I want to flag even that and I'll come to those tools, the regulatory barriers, but even those regulations that have been lifted to enable renewables are all very oriented towards large private industry. Now, ESCOM themselves have stated that when they start to pay a carbon tax liability from 2023, it'll be more than 11 billion rand per year. And they estimate that it will add 4 to 5% to the required year-on-year increases in the tariff since it's a pass-through. Now, I don't really see a way around raising tariffs overall. Of course, we want to mediate those increases as much as possible because we don't want to subsidize more expensive generation in this context of rising prices, for example, for new coal. But with the carbon tax, if ESCOM had the flexibility to make economic decisions on generation, then that carbon tax is a very useful tool. And we've seen that in other places in liberalized markets. But otherwise, it's a blunt instrument. The constraint, which many people raised in the chat, is regulatory and political, not economic. If your plants are not running, you run the runs that work. There's no merit order of dispatch. You don't choose not to run the incredibly expensive plants at the top end for your carbon tax reasons, because you're running everything that you can. So we really need to be looking at building out new generation capacity to fill this gap before these kinds of pricing tools might have any effect at all. And then I just want to add to what Galo said. The other part of this is the structure of these tariff rises and what that means for poor households. Free basic electricity, as noted, is a really important element in reducing energy poverty, FBE or FBAE. Of course, it looks like a big chunk of these subsidies, but that's not actually a subsidy we want to phase out in the short term. Of course, if households become richer and can pay for electricity, that's great. We actually want to work towards having a cleaner grid. So those residential subsidies are not contributing to emissions, but what we really want is for households to use much more electricity. We want them to replace their use of paraffin, wood, dung, and coal. You know, some households in Mpumalanga, 75% of households in some townships are still using coal for cooking and heating, and they should be using electricity. And kind of to put this in that broader context, we're talking about just transition at a national level, but we're not adequately cushioning poor households. These social elements of energy policy are not really getting the attention that they need. And I think this is a really helpful way of kind of starting that conversation. And then I just want to add, please, everyone who's on this webinar, you should go and have a look at the social costs reviews. It's super helpful to show exactly what costs are being pushed on, again, often in fact households in Mpumalanga who are bearing this, but the costs that are being put onto people for the fossil fuel system. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Jessie, and thanks very much, Galo, and thanks very much, Chido, as well, for a fantastic presentation. So we have an enormous amount of interest in the chat. We've got a lot of questions, so I'm going to do my best to work through everything. So, and some of these have already been touched upon by the panelists already. One thing I just wanted to that's come up in many times in the chat and also in the questions is about how the reform of the carbon tax can be a force for kind of positive change in the energy transition. There's what seems to me to be a fairly key opportunity. Reform is incoming. We know there's going to be budget announcements. There's definitely a view that says that the carbon tax, as Jessie just articulated, doesn't make a change to the merit order if you don't have enough power to meet the merit order anyway. So, but what should civil society be calling for? What should the Treasury be thinking about as the carbon tax exemptions are reformed? Also, you may want to talk about how feasible is it likely to be to remove carbon tax exemptions to the electricity sector? Do we think that will be tackled at all, or do we think that will be kind of put off for subsequent phases? So would anyone like to kind of just talk about how they feel, if they have any views about how that should be, how we should start to talk about that? So Jessie, you're nodding. I'll come to you first, I think. Oh no, okay. Galo, in that case, I'm going to pick on you.
Yeah, that's fine. I mean, I'm sure there's also a lot of people in attendance who can comment on that. Seen the frantic discussion on the chat. So, look, I think for me, there's a couple of things when it comes to carbon pricing and the way we structured it in South Africa. And the first thing it would be, in my mind, to simplify it, drastically. And if you're aiming at sending a price signal, it has to be a clear price signal. Okay. And I don't understate it when you need a whack of PhDs to not understand carbon pricing in South Africa, frankly. It's extremely complicated. Okay. And I think for me, it hides, a lot of things behind this complexity. And I think that's not helpful. If you want to really have an upfront price, then, make it simple, make it clear. And that's not particularly hard to do. The second thing is unresolved policy questions that we've been dealing with for more than decades is the integration of the carbon tax with other instruments, particularly carbon budgets. Something that has never been resolved. We effectively have two instruments that barely talk to each other. There is a degree of integration. If you meet your carbon budget, you can get a further exemption of the carbon tax. That's what I would call very weak integration of the two instruments. There's many other ways to do that. One way, which I think would make it very clear and enforceable, is to use the carbon budget as a primary instrument, and then use the carbon tax as the enforcement mechanism. That's one way to do that in, I think, a more meaningful way. Meaning, if you have a carbon budget as a company and you meet it, you've met your carbon budget. Of course, that means that you need to be having the capacity to set those carbon budgets effectively. But as it stands, the carbon budgets are very notional, I guess. And then the third point for me is, again, within that mix of measures, how do we ensure that we have a comprehensive mix of measure that tackles effectively what we want to achieve? And again, the elephant in the room is ESCOM. That I see the discussion in the chats about. If we think that a carbon price can have any impact on the decarbonization of ESCOM in the short term, then we seriously misguided, and that's not going to have an impact at this point. As Jesse has showed, there's little room to have any impact anyway, but we can have an impact through the mandate, through really our policy direction, and I think that's really important to tease that out in terms of how we do it, in terms of clarifying our message, making sure that the message is also integrated when it comes to, I guess, who we're targeting, which are industries and consumers. And then for those that are outside the mandate effectively, have clear policy directions for ESCOM, for a few others, that really need to be carbonized, whether or not we have a carbon price. And I think that's really important. So that's what I would start with on this. Thanks.
Fantastic. Thanks, Gayla. So now I'm just going to turn to Chido. So you've been presenting the inventory today, and carbon tax exemptions was a key subsidy that was identified during the inventory. So I wondered, Chido, how do you think about kind of how important carbon tax exemptions are, and what we could say to government and Treasury as they start to think about reforming or start to think about the next phase of the carbon tax?
Thanks, Richard. So I'm in two minds about it. Of course, we've seen from the report that when South Africa introduced the carbon tax, the aim of having such an instrument was to make the polluter pay. But in some cases, let's say if there were no exemptions in that, then went on to ESCOM, there may be arguments that the cost of the increased cost of supplying coal-fired power electricity would just fall down to the consumer. So when I say I'm in two minds about it, I agree with Jesse and Gayla on that it is not the silver bullet to address fossil fuel subsidies in South Africa, and also to try and transition the country to a low carbon or net zero. But I also do think that there's a role for it to play. The extent to which that will happen in South Africa, I mean, is yet to be seen. It'll be interesting to see what comes out of the budget. And as Memory was saying, as they're going to be phasing out some of these exemptions, it's going to be interesting to see what effect that has. But I do think there's a role for it to play, but definitely it's not the end all and be all of policy instruments to help us transition to net zero.
Fantastic, thank you very much. So Jesse, would you like to make any further comment on carbon taxes before we move on?
Yeah, I mean, I just want everyone to remember, I remember this, the extreme fights that happened about the carbon tax. It was a kind of a testament to the dogged obstinateness of National Treasury that it happened. And the opposition from industry was so enormous that we must know that it's having an effect. If we go beyond just power, it does drive decisions in other sectors. Of course, you need to have alternatives in those sectors, but we're starting to come to a place where a lot of our energy intensive industry does start to have alternatives that are economic to make over the next 10 or 15 years, transitioning to green steel, for example. So I think having this framework in place is very important, but we must also, think a lot more about the other supporting rules that you want to put in place to support, and that could be trade, it could be innovation policy, whatever, you know, but those packages are going to be very necessary, especially when you talk about net zero. Power is big, but power is quite easy in comparison to other sectors that we need to decarbonize over the next 30 years. Thanks.
Okay, before we leave carbon taxes altogether, I just wanted to bring in a colleague, Tara Lan, who's here, who's a specialist in such areas, and I wondered if she would like to make a comment. She was also involved in the tax chapter of this report as well. So Tara, would you like to make a comment?
Yeah, I think it's just important what Jesse was saying, that we should view this carbon tax in South Africa as a start. I'm from Australia, and it's one of maybe the only jurisdiction that put in place a carbon tax, and then it was torn down by political opposition. So as much as we might be critical of this tax, and it may not go, definitely doesn't go far enough, I think it's a good start. And some of those difficult political hurdles have been overcome. The other thing we need to do is think about carbon taxes in the context of all energy taxes, to look at effective carbon prices. And South Africa is doing reasonably well in that regard, at least with transport fuels. But the real problem is coal, which is effectively taxed, you know, barely at all, and particularly compared to its social costs. So whether you look at increasing carbon taxes or just traditional taxes on coal, there definitely needs to be some movement here to, you know, generate the revenues to pay for those social costs. Now, obviously, bringing up those prices to the sort of levels that match the externalities is extremely challenging, but really a very small increase would only, you know, would raise revenues that could be used for all sorts of purposes to help address those social issues that arise from higher prices. So we have to remember that revenue side of things, that it's an opportunity to generate revenue and use it to address some of these problems.
Thank you, Tara. So I've got one more kind of round of questions I want to do for the panel, but then I will endeavour to open the floor to contributions from the audience. So if you'd like to make a kind of a video intervention, then please put your hand up. I believe you have a hand, an electronic hand that is, of course. And I just remind you of please be respectful to each other, and please kind of yeah, try and be positive and to contribute in a way that's constructive. So if you do want to raise hands or send a message to the chat to indicate that you'd like to make a comment, and in the meantime, while people are deciding whether or not they want to kind of to make comments or raise hands, I'll just ask about post-COVID recovery spending. And someone asked the question that there's been a trend towards trying to make sure that post-COVID recovery spending is aligned with environmental and social objectives and not just propping up the status quo. So I just want to turn to the panel to ask kind of, to what extent do you think that's happening already, and how important is that? I think I will come to Chido first on this, because I know that Chido's been involved in the energy policy tracker, and perhaps would maybe comment on that. So Chido, I'll come to you first.
Thanks, Richard. You caught me off guard. I was replying to a question in the Q&A. Do you mind, I'm so sorry, do you mind starting off with somebody else, and then I'll come back? I just need to gather my thoughts whilst I finish answering this other question in the chat.
Sure then. Okay, Gayla, I think you've had enough time. So yeah, COVID recovery, is it an opportunity to kind of reorientate the economy, or is it too much of an emergency, and have all the funds gone to kind of bail out existing incumbent industries?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a massive opportunity, especially given the amount of money that's, you know, globally but also domestically is being channeled into the economy, and you know, that's really one of those key generational opportunities where you can leverage. Of course, then the question is, you know, as it happened, I think we had a bit of a divide when it comes to the actual plans that have been drafted, which were not perfect. It's never perfect, but quite ambitious and add a lot of elements that that really kind of spoke to directing the funds towards a more inclusive and green economy. I think the challenge was that a lot of those funds were never made available and were effectively not spent on what needed to be spent, or actually what even was in the plan. What we look when we look at what has been spent, you do see a fair amount of funding going towards the Department of Forestry, Fisheries and Environment. Some really interesting initiative around public employment that that have supported really inclusive employment and a bit more of a sustainable transition. But as you pointed out in your work as well, you know, the vast majority of those funds have not been going towards a more sustainable transition, despite, I think, some very interesting thinking and plans that were made. What I'd say though is that it's not because it hasn't been perfect to date that you know, we should kind of release the pressure. I think there is still an opportunity going forward. The recovery is not over by any means, and we really have an opportunity to shift the funding going forward. We have a good plan. Again, not perfect, but I think it's a good plan. Let's just implement it by and really tweak it on as we go. Would make quite a sizable impact. So that's what I could say for now on the topic. But I think, you know, we can still carry on, and hopefully let's see what comes in the budget next month. Thank you.
Great, thank you then. Chido, shall I come to you? I'm still not seeing many hands up. So if anyone does want to make a comment, please indicate that you do. Anyone who's been active in the chat as well wants to further elaborate on something they've said there, please send me a message or just make a note in the chat, and I will upgrade you to a panelist and let you speak. So Chido, without further ado, here's your now well thought through response to this question.
Thanks, Richard. So you made reference to the Energy Policy Tracker, which is an instrument, a tool. If you just Google energypolicytracker.org, that IISD developed with a whole host of other organizations. And what we've seen through the South Africa tab on that policy tracker is that post-COVID, there haven't been many tangible policies that focus on energy reform. The last time I checked, a lot of them were still in the proposal stage, or after being proposed in 2020, 2021, there hasn't been any update. Whereas if you compare other countries, of course, all countries are different, but if you do compare other countries, you'll see there might be more tangible numbers associated with, you know, certain stimuli rather. So, I mean, to answer your question, you know, the spending post-COVID should be driven by, you know, principles that we've talked about here, you know, principles of ensuring energy access, ensuring, as what JC spoke to, making sure that communities where they are most impacted by the transition, and also communities where they aren't even able to access the grid, that there is targeted support for them. So what we've seen with some of the policies in the Energy Policy Tracker with South Africa is that stimulus is still, by and large, locking in polluting energy at the public expense. And we can see this in this report as well when we talk about the social cost of carbon. Of course, it's more complicated in South Africa because of the fact that most of our energy comes from coal. So it's a more nuanced discussion that needs to take place, but definitely spending should be directed towards you know, an increase in renewable energy in the energy mix, and in a way that's designed to maximize those who are affected in the coal industry, both the workers and the communities, but then also post-COVID, we're looking at a lot of job loss. So also we need to make sure that we're prioritizing job security in levels of unemployment, and particularly if we're transitioning for those who are in the coal industry.
Okay, thank you very much. So we've got a number of colleagues on the line. I'd like to kind of ask if they would like to contribute. So I noticed that WWF were talking about a recent report they did, and Louise nowadays was making some comments about the implications of the carbon tax and whether it would be effective or whether regulation was a better approach to transition in the electricity sector. So I wonder if, Louise, would you be willing to comment briefly about WWF's kind of position, research on this? Sorry to pick on you.
So I was going to say no, Richard, but okay, I'll quickly talk about, look, I think your, IISD's work is more recent, and therefore it's very exciting that you're doing this. And WWF would be keen to see, how we can work with others, with yourselves and anyone else, in turning these things into actual advocacy to decision makers. So just to note that, but we're very excited that you're doing this work. Yeah, we did a piece of work which only looked, actually, Jesse and Britta Rencamp did it for us. It looked only at fossil fuels in the liquid fuel sector, and what the type of and quantum of subsidies for liquid fuels was, and what the opportunity cost of that was. In other words, if the state was either spending or foregoing income to X quantum, what could we rather have spent that on, in terms of housing, education, safety and security, whatever we want to spend it on for good social outcomes and upliftment of people, who are in extreme poverty. Could have gone straight to a universal basic income grant, for example. Yeah, so that's the one piece of work. Then you might be interested in the fact that we also did an exercise trying to cost externalities, basically a literature review. I also posted that. I don't know, Richard, what else do you want from me? Do you want me to talk about tax and budgets? Because I think Gail was wrong on that.
Well, that's interesting. So okay. Maybe just rather than leaving it hanging there, just a brief explanation, okay, and then we'll move on.
Business users, and I shouldn't say business because not all business, it's heavy emitting businesses, use this endlessly as a delaying tactic to say, well, until you resolve how the carbon tax and the carbon budgets align, so-called align with each other, you can't put in place either of them. They're independent and separate instruments. The one is a fiscal instrument, which is supposed to economically reorientate the whole economy through all the pieces of the economy. And the other one is a piece of regulation. So you could compare it to the fact that, through our licenses and other mechanisms, we all are in some form or another helping pay to have roads in this country. So that's like the carbon tax in a way. And at the same time, that doesn't, stop us having speed limits. So, which is like the carbon budget. And then if you exceed your speed limit, if you exceed your allocated carbon budget, you have broken a regulation or a law, and there must be, some legally specified penalties for that, which could be a fine, it could be the CEO going to jail. Wouldn't that make the mind focus? And one could say, okay, so how do we determine the quantum of this fine? And then you might say, okay, well, let's make it relate to the carbon tax rate by making the fine some kind of multiple of the carbon tax rate on those emissions which are in excess of the carbon budget, but there's no requirement that these two things necessarily talk to each other. Okay.
Okay, thank you very much, Louise, for your contribution. And there's another person who wanted to make an intervention was Guido Schnabel. So I'm sure I've got your name wrong. Sorry about that. So Guido, what would you like to raise or to talk about?
Yes, thank you, Richard. Sorry, I had to jump off during the session, and I posted a question to National Treasury about the determination of local content. I don't know if that was handled, but in essence, what I think is happening at the moment, and it happens in any kind of technology, is that the biggest issue we have is our energy generation, which is so carbon heavy. And once a technology disruption happens, and disruption means as a new technology which is tenfold cheaper or easier or simplistic, then there will be a disruption, meaning a very abrupt change. And globally, we're at this stage where this energy disruption happens. And therefore, my question is rather more into the policy needs to adopt that global trend, which it doesn't. And one of the things that describes this policy change is the IRP, our Integrated Resource Plan, which is very much outdated and doesn't take these new things into account. And with that, I think one can really make a huge difference in terms of shifting away from this carbon intensive energy towards the renewables very easily. And it doesn't really need so much subsidies because it comes already at an cost which is very low. And I think there was a comment just now about 12L, which also addresses some of those policy adjustments in terms of subsidies. But there's another thing that was more to the local content that I actually also wanted to ask, and I don't know if it was answered.
I don't think we did actually manage to cover the local content question, so thank you for posing it. I'm afraid we didn't get to it. We had limited time with memory, and we covered a few other things, so apologies for that. So we've had some fascinating comments and a great discussion. I've just posted the link to the full IISD report that's been discussed today. Just wanted to highlight a few of the key kind of findings from it, and one is the estimate of the total subsidies that were as 172 billion rand, and also the overall estimate for the kind of social cost of energy use of around 550 billion rand, a really significant number. And please do have a look at the report and follow Chido and I on Twitter, where we'll be posting links to op-ed pieces or other communications and infographics around this work. And thank you very much to all the participants and all the panelists for their contributions. I think it's been a fascinating area of debate, and I'm sure one that we'll be coming back to many times over the coming years. So a recording of the event will be posted online. Follow us on Twitter to find it. And we'll have that out in the next day or so. We'll also tweet a link if we're sharing the presentations, which I think we'll certainly be sharing the IISD presentation. We'll tweet links to that as well. So thank you everyone for staying with us, and speak to you again at the next IISD webinar.
Thanks everybody.
Thank you.